I'm delighted to be here in Krakow. This is only my second visit to Poland, which is remarkable given my great age. And I very much like to thank Professor Vitalish for the kind invitation to come here. And it's great to have the opportunity to talk to this distinguished gathering of scholars about what I see as an exciting new era of opportunity for medieval studies. And especially to do so here at the very centre of Europe, where so much medieval heritage remains as part of everyday life. Human imagination both produces and is sustained by story, by the narratives of the past and present, and these are in turn underpinned by the environments which give rise to them. Sarah Saleh has observed, quote, "We know the medieval through its extant material culture in the form of fragments." And she adds, "Considerable popular interest in the medieval coexists with a lack of precise information about it, so that its image is multiple, fragmentary, and visually unclear. The way in which modern culture understands the medieval past, and, as I shall argue, the ways in which it understands quite a bit about itself and its present, is thus shaped by medievalist re-representation of that past, as much as by material survivals from the Middle Ages. Now, the medieval, thanks very largely to J.R.R. Tolkien, has become a conventional setting for fantasy, offering the benefits of intertextual illusion and an assumed pre-existing familiarity with medieval or pseudo-medieval culture. It is, of course, possible to write fantasy set elsewhere, whether in the future, at which point it becomes science fiction, or in a different past period. Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell of 2004, for example, is set in 18th century England, though that is, in technical terms, and here I draw on Farah Mendelssohn's classifications, an intrusion fantasy, in which magic erupts into a historically plausible reality. And China Mieville and Neil Gaiman have written intrusion fantasies set in modern London and modern America. Immersion fantasies, the mode in which George R.R. Martin's book series A Song of Ice and Fire is written, are more traditionally imagined as complete worlds, whose difference from modernity has to be marked. Yet the time and space within which the story is set will not be totally unfamiliar if the author's world-building task is not to be exhausting. Just imagine making up a complete world from scratch without building blocks from our own present and past. And thus the medieval functions as both recognizable and estranged, in part because of its fragmentary survival in our own culture. And as Arthur Lindley observes, though here he's speaking of medieval film, I think his argument is equally valid for medieval fantasy in other media. He says, films of the medieval period present their mater in an analogical relation, as type or anti-type of current circumstances, as allegorical representation of them, or as estranged retelling. The distant past, he says, may mirror us. We, not it, are the real subject, but it does not lead to us. So the past mirrors us, but it does not lead to us if it's far enough back. And this is an important observation to which I will return. Medieval fantasy does not purport to explain how our modern society came about in any linear sense, but the fantasy world is rather analogous to ours, and that's a crucial part of making meaning for fans, for George Martin, and for the two showrunners of the HBO TV show Game of Thrones, David Benioff and Daniel Weiss, and of course for us medievalism-ist scholars, as we like to call ourselves. So what I want to talk about today are the ways in which A Song of Ice and Fire and the show Game of Thrones open up questions about how the medieval fantasy and the modern world relate to one another. First, I want to discuss how Martin and Benioff and Weiss construct and articulate their medievalized universe in relation to earlier medievalisms. And then I'll move on to look at the way that genre, gender, and cross-mediality and some of the key tropes of fantasy work in the series. And finally, I'll consider how the Game of Thrones phenomenon can be harnessed by those of us working in the academy to incite and infuse student and popular interest in medieval cultures. And first, a word or two of explanation. When I talk about the series, I mean both the books and the show, but I'll call the series Game of Thrones because life is too short to keep saying A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones all the time. So George Martin himself was an established sci-fi and fantasy writer before he embarked on the book series, which has made him world famous. He studied journalism at Northwestern University in Chicago back in the late 60s, but he was also a history minor. And his profound and continuing interest in history, in particular political and social history, shapes his approach to world building in A Song of Ice and Fire. For Martin has done a good deal of research into, and importantly, a good deal of thinking about different medieval societies and how they function. It's not always possible to identify exactly what he's been reading. Martin himself is prone to muddying the waters with a certain amount of misdirection, particularly when he claims that his inspiration was the 15th century English Wars of the Roses. Now, the chime between York and Stark and Lannister and Lancaster is indeed suggestive, but Martin has ranged much more widely than that in his historical research. And he cited the French author Maurice Drouin as his literary hero. Between 1955 and 1960, Drouin wrote a 6-volume novel series relating the history of the kings of France and to some extent England in the early 14th century. A 7th and final novel was written in 1977, but it wasn't translated into English before 2013. And Martin endorses Les Rois Maudits, the Accursed Kings, as it's called in English, as you can see here, the original Game of Thrones. If you love Game of Thrones, you will adore Les Rois Maudits, we're told. And it is clear that Martin derived a great deal from Drouin. And the 14th century in some ways offers a better fit for contemporary... Oh, what have I done here? Yeah. A better fit for contemporary Westeros. The character of Cersei, for example, is very much more like Isabella, the she-wolf of France, as portrayed by Drouin, than she is like Queen Marguerite of Anjou. Both Isabella and Cersei are instrumental in the deaths of their hated husbands. Both take lovers, Isabella as an aid to gaining power while her son is a minor, and both struggle to find a role when that son grows up and marries. And in a 2013 piece for the Guardian newspaper, Martin says this, I hope you can see it, but I'll read it anyway. The Accursed Kings has it all. Iron kings and strangled queens, battles and betrayals, lies and lust, deception, family rivalries, the curse of the Templars, babies switched at birth, she-wolves, sin, she-wolves, sin and swords, the doom of a great dynasty, and all of it, or most of it, straight from the pages of history. And believe me, the Starks and the Lannisters have nothing on the Capet and the Plantagenets. Whether you're a history buff or a fantasy fan, Drouin's epic will keep you turning pages. It's the original Game of Thrones. But for Martin, also he says, the possibility of writing a series like Drouin's about medieval English history, founded on his keenness to include fantasy elements, and on his awareness that suspense, which is a key element in his narrative practice, doesn't work when history is the ultimate spoiler. Martin himself explains why he rejected the idea of a historical novel sequence in an important interview with Rolling Stone magazine, published in 2014. And this is the second quote you can see on the slide. But the problem with straight historical fiction is you know what's going to happen. If you know anything about the Wars of the Roses, you know that the princes in the tower aren't going to escape. I wanted to make it more unexpected, bring in some more twists and turns. The main question was the dragons. Do I include dragons? Yes, George, you do. And this is indeed an advantage that the writer of modern epic fantasy has over the historical novelist. He or she can invent freely. And thus, although we might recognize the historical antecedents of some of the themes of Game of Thrones, as the historian Tom Holland has written, episodes from the history of our own world lie in wait for the characters like booby traps. We think we know how the story should pan out, but we're often wrong. So reading Drouin persuaded Martin that he could write at the kind of length that he envisaged for his series, that questions of power, control, effectiveness in rule were central to the kind of epic that he had in mind, but that in order to include his dragons, he had to write in the infinitely more popular genre of fantasy, and so he had to abandon the idea of writing a straightforward historical novel sequence. Martin may well have taken over the important narrative technique of varying point of view chapters from Drouin, and there are speedy changes, particularly in the later novels of Drouin, between the characters in focus whose stories run in parallel. This technique of narrative interlace, used in, for example, the French Vulgate prose romances about Arthur, is already a tried and tested medieval technique. And these switches between points of view also facilitate one of Martin's favourite structural devices, the cliffhanger. But now I want to move on to talk about Martin's particular medievalism, because beyond his historian's training, Martin is also steeped in what, for the purposes of this lecture, I will characterize as the old medievalism, the medievalism inherited from the 19th century and embodied by authors such as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and taken up to a more limited extent by the Oxford School of Fantasy writers who followed them. Tolkien and Lewis's visions of the medieval past, whose literature they both taught regularly, was essentially nostalgic and mythic. Their writing laments the displacement of the old certainties of medieval hierarchies by the encroaching modern, suggesting that much has been lost when Narnia became accessible only from within a wardrobe, and as the Shire loses its innocence. The modern world is subject to what fantasy scholars call thinning, the slow process of disenchantment, as magic and wonder are crowded out by science and technology, as Dan Hassler-Forrest has argued recently. And he goes on to say the central historical development around which Lord of the Rings story world is organized is not about avoiding the transition into modernity, but ensuring that this inevitable thinning happens in the least objectionable way. Frodo and the elves set sail westward from Middle-earth, and with them go magic and elvish wisdom. And so too, at the end of the Narnia sequence, neither Narnia itself nor the disappointing modern world of railways, lipstick, and silk stockings can substitute for the transcendental bliss of union with Aslan. Tolkien's nostalgia for a pre-capitalist society of simple agrarian production, as Hassler-Forrest says, the utopian fantasy of a society without alienation by wage labour, the uninterrogated certainties of the mystique of kingship, is neatly skewered by Martin thus in this quotation, again from the Rolling Stone interview. Ruling is hard. This was maybe my answer to Tolkien, whom, as much as I admire him, I do quibble with. Lord of the Rings had a very medieval philosophy, that if the king was a good man, here we are, we can see him, Viggo Mortensen, if the king was a good man, the land would prosper. We look at real history, and it's not that simple. Tolkien can say that Aragorn became king and reigned for 100 years, and he was wise and good. But Tolkien doesn't ask the question, what was Aragorn's tax policy? Did he maintain a standing army? What did he do in times of flood and famine? And what about all those orcs? Martin is precisely interested, thanks in part to his training as a historian, in Aragorn's tax policy, in the real nuts and bolts of rule. He's interested in how armies are organised, how crown expenditure is financed, how international credit works, and importantly for us as scholars, how monopolies on literacy and the separation of learning and religion affects the development of cultures. Martin's, but not his alone, is a new kind of medievalism, writing in reaction to Tolkien as medievalist fantasy must, but gesturing beyond itself and the constraints of its imagined universe. So, for example, Martin reacts consistently and critically to the romantic chivalric dream of knights and ladies, of castles and minstrels, as in the old songs about Jonquil and her knight fool Florian, that bewitch Sansa and make her believe herself to be in love with Joffrey. And here's Sansa's first glimpse of chivalry in action at the tourney of the hand. The splendour of it all took Sansa's breath away. The shining armour, the great chargers caparisoned in silver and gold, the shouts of the crowd, the banners snapping in the wind, and the knights themselves, the knights most of all. It's better than the songs, she breathed. Now, a more pragmatic and critical view of chivalry is robustly offered by the Hound, who, whenever he's addressed as Sir, always growls, "I'm not a knight." And this is what he has to say. A knight's a sword with a horse. The rest, the vows and the sacred oils and the lady's favours, they're silk ribbons tied around the sword. Maybe the sword's prettier with silk ribbons hanging off it, but it will kill you just as dead. Well, bugger your ribbons and shove your swords up your arses. Okay, well, that's the Hound speaking for you. But it's interesting that Martin and Benioff and Weiss work hard to debunk that popular myth of chivalry without seeking either to modify it or to replace it with a more nuanced account. Chivalry, courtliness, is a behaviour that power players employ to get ahead, and we don't see any of its positive effects as a civilising process in the sense of Norbert Elias. Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire is fundamentally epic fantasy, exhibiting most of the conventional features of the genre. It's public, political, concerned with the fates of nations, in particular the question of who should sit on the Iron Throne, and it begins in medias res. It features more than one journey to the otherworld or the underworld, and it invokes the religious or supernatural as an important part of its framework. Epic attracts companion and symbiotic genres, and these offer narrative space for those elements which high epic ignores or minimizes. So Martin thus incorporates other genres. For example, the detective story, Who Killed John Arryn and Why?, which is the burning question of the first book and series. I'm sorry, the only picture I have of John Arryn is of him dead and looking distinctly uncanny there. This is the burning question of the first book and series, though the answer only comes finally in season 5. And influential too is the buddy movie with its odd couples, Tyrion and Jorah Mormont, Brienne and Jaime, Brienne and Pod, Arya and the Hound, Jon Snow and Ygritte, and we can see Tyrion and Varys there on the walls of King's Landing. Now, Jon Snow and Ygritte is in fact a tale that at times verges on screwball comedy in generic terms, but it ends tragically. And it's worth noticing that unlike the traditional masculine buddy movie, with its reliance on differential distribution of brain and brawn, or the funny guy and the straight man, many of Martin's odd couples are cross-gender. And horror too plays its part, with the zombie army of the dead, and the terrifyingly inhuman White Walkers. And there's comedy as well, often involving Tyrion, Brienne, or Pod, and perhaps the dominant subgenre, romance, but romance understood in its medieval, not its modern sense. In contrast to epic, medieval romance tends to expand the roles of women, giving space to the private emotion, exploring a whole range of human relationships that epic plays down or leaves out. And so too in the epic's modern reframing, particularly in our present century, the audience expects, demands even, to see women as actors, as exercising agency. The veil is lifted on the private passions that influence the public action, and they also want to empathize with the hero or heroes who now must have complex inner lives. The straightforward empire-building project, the battle against the monolithic form of evil, even saving the world, all these epic aims are no longer enough. Yet, strikingly, romance in its modern sense is distinctly lacking in the show. Heterosexual love is consistently shown as unreliable, perverse, or doomed. Romantic love, arguably an invention and certainly a refinement of the Middle Ages, comes under consistent pressure. The performance of knightly wooing within a chivalric code of behaviour is shown to be empty and strategic when Joffrey undertakes it. Sansa's long journey towards disillusioned pragmatism is aided after her father's death by the sceptical running commentary on love offered by Cersei, exemplified by remarks like this: "The more people you love, the weaker you are. You'll do things for them that you know you shouldn't do. You'll act the fool to keep them happy, to keep them safe. Love no one but your children. And love is poison, a sweet poison, yes, but it will kill you all the same." And other passionate attachments, Jon and Ygritte, Robb and Talisa, end disastrously. Jon's feelings for the wildling woman are always in tension with his loyalties to the Night's Watch, and Robb's relationship with Talisa in the show is entirely understandable and sympathetic in modern terms. They meet cute, they tussle a bit about different values and viewpoints, they kiss, they become lovers, they're clearly made for each other. In contrast to the books, where Robb is entrapped by considerations of honour into marrying a minor nobleman's daughter, for whom he has little feeling, in the show Robb's is a true and modern love, yet it doesn't save him and his pregnant wife at the massacre of the Red Wedding. The show's most significant generic model within the epic structure has emerged as the Bildungsroman. The learning curves of the younger generation, Daenerys, not pictured, Jon Snow, Sansa, Arya, Bran and Theon, if not Cersei's children, have been crucial to the developing storylines. The young people's goals, apart from Daenerys, are not clearly constituted. Marrying and living happily ever after is explicitly problematized through the romantic and marital experiences of Jon and Sansa. Family reunion for the Starks and the restoration of their fortunes may serve to give closure to their histories. Daenerys has learned about power and politics, about strategy and trust, yet she remains lonely and isolated in her present situation. And Arya, too, is on a steep learning curve from tomboy to trained killer. She's learning discipline and ruthlessness in step with one another. And Sansa looks set to metamorphose in the coming season from a victim into a major player in the game. And then there's Tyrion, perhaps the world's most unlikely hero, whose journey has taken him from the Wall to Slaver's Bay, from dissolute drunk to brilliant war strategist, from parricide to de facto ruler of Meereen. And where Tyrion will end up in the game is one of the series' most intriguing questions. Allied with the key move that he learnt, as I've argued, from Druon and Tolkien, of multiplying his heroes, is Martin's emphasis on the redemptive arc. And here it's, excuse me. Here it's Jaime who has done most to change from the man who pushed Bran from the tower, with that throwaway line, "the things I do for love," in the very first episode. But the things he does for love, for his daughter, for his brother, for his friend Brienne, have humanized Jamie, and with the loss of his hand have come humility, resignation, and wisdom. One of Martin's most important generic innovations, as I've mentioned, is his abandonment of the convention of empathetic alignment with a single epic hero. Instead, the series offers a number of possible heroes, some from the flawed older generation of men, like Ned Stark and Stannis Baratheon, and some from the next generation, importantly now including women. And this is what Martin says: "If you look at the books, my heroes and viewpoint characters are all misfits. They're outliers. They don't fit the roles society has for them. They're cripples, bastards, and broken things. A dwarf, a fat guy who can't fight, a bastard, and women who don't fit comfortably in the roles society has for them." Well, the juxtaposition of women with cripples, bastards, and broken things is in some way troubling, but it also flags up another of Martin's major departures from the Tolkien model. Women are foregrounded and given unconventional roles, a move which in part explains the show's wide appeal to female viewers. The focus on female experience has provoked repeated questions about sexualization and sexual violence. In part, the nudity in sexual scenes, such as the notorious sexposition scene in Peter Baelish's brothel in season 1, episode 7, is explained by HBO's careful positioning of itself as a cable channel which dares to show what the more anodyne terrestrial channels of US TV can't show. And in part too, as Andrew Hickson has argued, quote, "The unmodern setting of medieval films is used as a license to project taboo images and actions, particularly around the body and what might be done to it or done with it, or how it might be displayed." The new medieval, then, in contrast to the idealized, chivalric Tolkien medieval, is consistently framed as gritty. Violence, in particular sexual violence, is foregrounded. But that said, the transmedia nature of the Game of Thrones franchise means that the showrunners are in a dynamic feedback relationship with the fan communities and with the commenters. There were more than 700,000 comments on the Red Wedding across social media immediately after the episode The Rains of Castamere was broadcast. And you can see here people Instagramming pictures of themselves crying at the outcome of the Red Wedding and various unkind remarks from people who'd read the books and knew what was coming. And this dialogue between the fans and the producers has, I think, meant that what's been interpreted by some commentators as gratuitous nudity and sexualization has been dialed back in the most recent seasons. Of course, plot developments have led to the closing of Baelish's brothels. But the director of season 5, episode 6, who had to handle Sansa's rape on her wedding night, was careful not to show the violence directly by focusing on the face of Theon, who was forced to witness Ramsay Bolton's behaviour. And Theon thus reflected the audience back to itself, also constrained to watch, though essentially to imagine what was happening out of shot. And having handled this in this particularly, I think, thoughtful way, the commentators then criticised the show for making this painful scene all about Theon instead of Sansa, suggesting that the directors are damned if they do and damned if they don't. And masculinity in its traditional forms comes under considerable pressure too in the series. As I mentioned earlier, the knightly identity is discounted, apart perhaps from Sir Barristan Selmy, one of a dying breed and one who is in fact in the show dead. Ned and Robb Stark's versions of heroic masculinity fail. But Varys and Tyrion, and perhaps Theon, are emerging as queer alternatives to the old heterosexual model. Tyrion's compulsive philandering is a thing of the past, while the other two are castrates. Jon Snow may have abandoned his vows of celibacy in the past, but now sex seems to be the last thing on his mind. Yara in the show has become a lesbian who frequents brothels along with her men, and many fans were delighted to sense a frisson between her and Daenerys when they met in Meereen, and you can see a kind of love-struck dragon there trying to make tangible that bond between them. The women seem likely to play crucial roles in the endgame: Sansa, Daenerys, Yara, perhaps Brienne and Arya. Unsettles the traditional epic paradigms. These women are not princesses to be handed over to the epic hero as his prize. I just want to say something now quickly about fantasy tropes. Hassler Forrest notes, instead of Tolkien's elegiac nostalgia for an older, more innocent world, Martin's fantastic fiction reverses this dynamic to show an emergent modernity in which all the old numinous powers come roaring back to life. Show and books begin with an uncanny scene. Men from the Night's Watch ride out from Castle Black to investigate reports of wildlings at large in the haunted forest. They find corpses arranged in a strange ritualistic pattern. They report back to their commanding officer, who insists on seeing for himself, but when they return, the corpses have gone. And then they are attacked by what will turn out to be a White Walker, watched by the animated corpse, and she's the one at the top, of a girl with strangely ice blue eyes. And apart from some further Walking Dead activity at the Wall, that's the last that the first book and season manifests of the supernatural until the very end, when Daenerys emerges from the fire with her newly hatched dragons. Magic is suppressed, for this is a world which is already thinned, in which the dragons shrank to the size of dogs a century ago and are now extinct. The topos, so typical of intrusion fantasy, the awakening of the old magic, complicates and animates a world which up until now has largely engaged with political and social history. And to sideline magic to this degree in fantasy is a bold move. Just as Martin challenges the conventions of epic, so he makes the audience or the readership wait for the dragons until the final moments of the first book. And it's not until season 2, episode 2, that we get a clear sight of a White Walker, viewed through the horrified perspective of Jon Snow. Magic is generally mistrusted in Westeros. Only a few maesters study it, largely as a theoretical exercise. In the East, magic is practiced in various forms, the taboo blood magic in particular. But with the rebirth of the dragons, certain kinds of magic are growing stronger. And as an interesting corollary to this, it's clear that Martin gives little credence to religion. Each people has its own faith, and the practitioners of the faith of the Seven, the focus of the last 2 seasons, are largely repressive, hypocritical, or fanatical. But nevertheless, the power of resurrection is ascribed to R'hllor, the Red God, and has been proven in the cases of Beric Dondarrion, Jon Snow, and in the books Lady Stoneheart. And there is a risk, I think, in overusing resurrection, one that the show limits by excising Lady Stoneheart. It challenges the epic rule that the journey into the other world is the marker of the hero alone, and its effects on Jon Snow seem to oscillate between his familiar heroism and an emptied-out detachment. Tolkien and Lewis, it's worth recalling, limit their resurrections to the most obvious Christ surrogates, and they have one apiece in either cycle. Finally, in classifying Game of Thrones under the category of the new medieval, it's worth considering how epic always reaches outside itself to the contemporary, even as it positions itself as a historical account of the affairs of gods and men. Medievalist epic operates, as Lindley notes, as an analogue, if not necessarily allegory. And Game of Thrones is no exception. making use of multivalent symbols, in particular the wall, which has seized the popular and the presidential imagination in the US. And Neil Gaiman has recently reported on his book tour associated with his new retelling of Norse mythology that whenever he relates the Norse tale of the master builder raising the walls of Asgard, he gets an uneasy laugh. And so too, the politics of Slaver's Bay, foregrounding Daenerys' futile battle to win the hearts and minds of the population and to impose her own Western values on a very different culture, is as doomed as US and coalition interventions in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the phrase Game of Thrones has become shorthand for political manoeuvring of every colour, from the change of leadership in the UK following the EU referendum, which last year was consistently referred to a real-life Game of Thrones. You can see some of the culprits from British politics there. And there's also the YouTube video Winter is Trumping, which has been watched by millions, and the production, too, of various highly topical memes, such as this one, produced when Mitt Romney was said to be in talks about joining the Trump team in the White House. And the White Walkers have been interpreted as symbolizing numerous threats, from climate change to war to the inevitability of death. And the series thus owes much of its appeal to the scope it gives to be read as an analogue to our own times. Though it's worth remembering that when Martin began to conceptualize his story world in the early 1990s, nuclear winter was more topical than global warming, and the most salient wall then was the newly fallen Berlin Wall. The imaginative and analogical power of the series, however, resides in the transferability of such charged symbols. I've mentioned already that Game of Thrones is a classic example of a cross-media phenomenon, operating across books, TV show, fan sites like Winter is Coming, fan-built wikis such as A Wiki of Ice and Fire and the Game of Thrones wiki, as well as the hugely important Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire subreddits. Merchandising, everything from figurines to craft beer to T-shirts to video games, builds and consolidates the fan base between book publications and show season premieres. The positive feedback loop between the fan communities and showrunners, with Martin himself making important interventions in the media and at Comic Cons, and the fact that the show has now run out of book material in a number of storylines and is thus faced with creating a different recension of the narrative, absent Martin's definitive version, interestingly unsettles theories of auteurship, narratology, and authenticity. Who will own or authorize the final version, assuming that one of the story's iterations can be understood as definitive? In conclusion, I want to offer some reflections on what I've been calling the new medievalism. It's an engagement with the medieval past that is critical rather than nostalgic or idealistic, precisely because it is anchored in historically based economic and social realities. The excision of nostalgia has the effect of anti-thinning. The magic and numinosity, which seemed to have vanished, was by no means benevolent, and when it comes roaring back, as in intrusion fantasy, when it comes roaring back, as in the intrusion fantasy novel, its eruption is world-changing and terrifying. Nor is it clear, also as in intrusion fantasy, that once reawakened magic can be controlled, eliminated, or even negotiated with. Such metaphysical uncertainty, particularly around the White Walkers, is profoundly unsettling. And the new medievalism is gritty, in the terminology of Sharon Zukin, a social geographer, making implicit claims for authenticity through its intensification of the graphic violence and sex, the dirt, the mud, all the things that Monty Python and the Holy Grail foregrounded so many years ago. These things were present in the books, but are exaggerated and stylized when visually realized in the show. The new medievalism, as represented by Game of Thrones, has undoubtedly generated the largest audience for medieval fantasy since Tolkien. To call the show The Lord of the Rings for the 21st century is no exaggeration. Since I've been working on Game of Thrones, I've been asked, usually by journalists, not by fellow academics, how research into this popular culture phenomenon can be justified. Isn't Game of Thrones too trivial, too popular, too sensationalist for us to be interested in? There are, it seems to me, two possible answers to this. The first is to make the argument that Game of Thrones operates as a kind of gateway drug, that just like Tolkien, it can be marketed as a soft introduction to medieval literature and history, along the lines of an Amazon recommendation. If you like Game of Thrones, you'll love Beowulf, or Mongol history, or Norse mythology, and that's how we entice the little ones in. But increasingly, university teachers are harnessing Game of Thrones as a teaching tool to inspire student interest in genuine medieval phenomena, as I know from many contacts in teaching around the world, from Brazil to Canada, from Australia to Iceland. And secondly, it's also vital to insist on the relevance and value of Game of Thrones as a cultural phenomenon in its own right. The series is capable of analysis in traditional literary terms, investigating themes, characters, genres, structure. The whole armory of narratology can be brought to bear on it, and that's what my next book on the topic is going to be about. But also, crucially, the series has proved the translatability of and generated a shorthand for the discussion of enduring political and social ideals in the modern globalized world. Thank you.